Warning! This video contains spoilers for the late game of Silksong. If you're not ready for those, then come back to this video later. Hey, Silksong released. And with that release, it's brought a huge amount of new lore, story, and character information to add to the impressive amount of lore that Hollow Knight already has. And with all the new information that's come to light with the release of Silksong, I want to go back and examine some lingering questions left behind in Hollow Knight. In particular, I want to focus on what this information tells us about the Weavers who chose to make Deepnest their home after fleeing Farloom. There are a couple of questions that I want to answer. First, why did the Weavers choose to settle in Deepnest? And second, who was the king of Deepnest and what was his relationship with the Weavers? Let's begin. After a very long time spent devising ways to better continue the stasis of Grandmother Silk, or perhaps even kill her altogether, the Weavers eventually determined that these would be impossible tasks. All of their attempts had ended in failure, and so they resorted to their final plan. They fully left the task of keeping their mother asleep to the common bugs of Farloom Citadel, used their farsights to find the best routes to new homes, and then fled Farloom, away from their creator's looming wrath. The Weavers split into many different clans, spreading out across the wastes of the outside world, and it was one of these clans, possibly led by Hera the Beast, that eventually found its way into the caverns of Hallownest. It's unclear exactly how far along in Hallownest's timeline the Weavers showed up, but given that the Weavers only chose to live in the darkest corners of these caverns, it's likely that the Pale King had already risen to power and taken over the central area of the caves when they arrived. However, even if this wasn't the case, that still doesn't change the fact that Deepnest would have been the most appealing place for these Weavers to call home. After taking just one look at Deepnest, it's clear why the Weavers decided to settle here, as Deepnest is effectively a natural fortress. The dark, twisting, claustrophobic caves at the corner of Hallownest made for an excellent, naturally defensible hideaway for a clan of spiders fleeing from an angry god. The local wildlife of the region made it incredibly difficult to traverse. The dirt carvers in the eastern caves of Deepnest have the habit of constantly ambushing any intruders to their territory before burrowing away again, providing a constant nagging presence for any invaders. Furthermore, the corpse creepers, investing the corpses of bugs killed in the region, make it difficult for intruders to tell the difference between friend and foe. Of course, the Weavers also added defenses of their own to this already nightmarish landscape. At the top of Farloom, there is a species of bug known as a garpid, a centipede-like bug which hunts by burrowing in a straight line, occasionally exiting the dirt to attack prey. Those familiar with Deepnest will see the extreme similarity of both the name and behavior to Deepnest's garpids, which hunt in the same fashion. As such, it's clear that the garpids are either a variation of garpids brought to Deepnest by the Weavers, which evolved to thrive in its tight caverns with plenty of prey, or the garpids are simply juvenile garpids, still brought to Deepnest by the Weavers. The garpids make for another incredible defensive feature, as they have completely impenetrable scales, making it impossible to kill or even harm them. Their immense size makes it impossible to stop them from moving along their paths, forcing intruders to follow specific routes to navigate around them, and the deafening sounds of them burrowing through the earth serves to disorient anyone passing through. There are also countless pitfall traps constructed throughout Deepnest, making the terrain even more frustrating to navigate, and the stalking devouts, whose enormous bodies and impenetrable mandible things make some tunnels completely impassable and deadly. More on these guys later. Lastly, the Weavers wouldn't have been willing to integrate into Hallownest, as they would have been wary of the Pale King. They were fleeing from Farloom to escape the wrath of a pale being after all, so immediately putting their trust in another one to protect them would have seemed like a bad idea to them. However, the only obvious entrances to Deepnest all pass through Hallownest, so perhaps the Weavers preferred to remain sovereign from Hallownest while still managing to hide behind the Pale King for protection. However, while the Weavers may not have been willing to integrate with Hallownest, they still would have had to integrate with someone by moving into Deepnest. And this leads me to one of my main questions for this video, a long lingering question from Hollow Knight. Who exactly was Deepnest's king? A lore tablet at the edge of the fungal wastes referring to Deepnest speaks of a king that once ruled over that land, calling him their dead sire, once of honored caste. In Silksong, the Weavers all refer to each other as sisters, spiders, meaning that the Weavers are an entirely female species. This then rules out one of the options for this king's identity. He cannot have been a weaver. Because of this, the most likely explanation for the king's relationship with the Weavers is that he ruled over Deepnest before their arrival. However, this still leaves the question of what the king actually was. Since he likely ruled Deepnest before the Weavers arrived, it stands to reason that he would be a similar species to some of the creatures living in Deepnest. This then leaves us with a couple options. One of the most prominent creatures found in Deepnest is the dirt carver, which inhabits much of the eastern half of the region. However, it isn't really apparent that these creatures would have been involved in any sort of society, given their tendency towards being hunters. While this could be due to the infection forcing them to revert back to their base instincts, it's also notable that they don't live anywhere close to the distant village, which is likely where the king would have ruled from. It's true that the village is made of hanging balls of silk, which seems to imply it being the home of the Weavers, but at the same time, it lacks the distinct architectural style of the Weaver's den, implying this village could have existed before the Weavers arrived. Not to mention that there's really no evidence of hanging balls of silk being used as homes for Weavers in Silksong, with there instead being the presence of dens that very much match the style architecturally of the Weaver's den. If the dirt carvers can't be found close to the capital, this implies that they wouldn't have been a part of Deepnest's former kingdom. But this route of theorizing has opened up another path. If the giant silk balls making up the village weren't created by the Weavers, then that could mean that the king and his subjects were also spiders. Silksong established that all the Weavers are female as well as sisters, meaning it would have been impossible for several reasons for them to reproduce with each other. And yet, in the area around the Weaver's den, there are several little Weavers, which appear to be Weaver children. This implies that the Weavers were reproducing with the local population of Deepnest, thus creating partial Weavers. This would also explain the presence of the stalking Devouts, which despite not being full Weavers, still bear distinct Weaver mask markings on their mandibles. The Deep Hunters, which have the same 6 eyes as the Weavers, and the Deeplings, which are implied to be the newborns of the Spider tribe. This is a strong explanation, but there's still one more interesting option I'd like to explore. In the eastern half of Deepnest, as well as under the failed tramway, the many corpses of the tram workers there are filled with corpse creepers, which impersonate their hosts long enough to lull new hosts into a false sense of security before killing them too. This is very interesting, given that when the knight arrives at the beast's den, it's met with this reception.
Greetings. You are very tired. Sit and rest.
We are friends. Welcome. Sit and rest. Please, sit and rest.
It is warm and safe. Sit and rest.
Welcome. You need rest. Sit and rest. Below the main building, there's a smaller building filled with the corpses of Hallownest's tram workers, likely past victims of these mimics, as evidenced by their Dreamnail dialogue reading, "Not friends," meaning that they were lured in the same way as the knight was. The fact that these mimics are directly in the distant village opens the possibility that the creatures living in Deepnest society before the Weavers arrived were mimics, and perhaps their ruler would have been some form of mimic king. This could also explain the existence of Nosk. Nosk hunts in a very similar manner to these corpse mimics by luring in prey with a friendly, familiar visage, and its body has a long, spindly, bony structure, making it similar to the Weavers. Could Nosk be the offspring of a mimic and a Weaver? It's hard to tell, but it makes for an interesting theory. However, given the fact that these partial weavers still share the spider-like qualities of their full-blooded counterparts, and the fact that the distant village is made up of large balls of silk that do not match any weaver architecture in Silksong, I believe that the spider explanation for Deepnest's local tribe and king is the most likely one. The king of Deepnest was likely a spider ruling over a spider tribe, and when the weavers arrived, they integrated themselves into this society, causing the new offspring from the tribe to share qualities with the weavers themselves. However, this leads to another question. What happened to Deepnest's king? Now, in an ideal scenario, we could just say that the king passed away at some point after the weavers arrived. When they showed up, the king and Hera would have ruled alongside each other, the weavers would have used their ability with silk to improve the lives of Deepnest's population, and integrated with the locals. After the king's passing, Hera would have taken over as the sole leader of Deepnest until the infection arrived, causing Deepnest to collapse. However, given the track record of the weavers, I really don't think this is what happened. In Silksong, the weavers are described as bitter, scheming, whispering traitors who tempted the pilgrims of Farloom into the citadel only to ensnare them in their scheme to keep Grandmother Silk in her slumber forever. They were granted higher thought and power by their mother and used it to seal her away and take Farloom for themselves. They're also known to be highly intolerant of anyone who would question their actions, including other weavers. They first built the slab specifically to house the first sinner, who spoke out against the weaver's divine right to rule Farloom. And they brutally disfigured Widow, a weaver who remained loyal to Grandmother Silk by removing her mask and driving stakes into her back. These are not the actions of creatures who would gladly rule alongside an established figure. In the Beast's Den, there's a large trilobite statue, referred to in the game's files as a shrine, which is a place regarded as holy due to housing a sacred relic. While I've theorized that the distant village itself wasn't created by the weavers, this shrine certainly was. It is the same strange style as many weaver constructions, and attacking it with spells reveals that there's a seal on it, something that can only be created with weaver silk due to it being infused with soul. While this is somewhat speculative, my theory on what happened to Deepnest King? He's in there. Or maybe his corpse is. Or who knows, maybe that thing is his corpse. That last one is actually pretty unlikely, seeing as it seems to be made of metal. In any case, it certainly fits the characterization of the weavers. When they first arrived in Deepnest, they became integrated with the local population, bred with them to create weaver offspring, and either killed Deepnest's king or sealed him away within this shrine, which would make the king's corpse the holy relic in question. And thus the weavers would have taken the entire region for themselves. Even if the shrine isn't housing the king, I still doubt the weavers had nothing to do with his death. This concludes my analysis of the Weavers of Deepnest, and the information that Silksong has given us about them. The Weavers chose to live in Deepnest due to it being a naturally defensible region that would make it difficult for the bugs of the choir to reach them, and they chose not to integrate with Hallownest due to be wary of joining with the Pale King, a pale being similar to the one they were fleeing from. They instead chose to usurp the throne of Deepnest's king, sealing him away in the distant village and taking the mantle of rule for themselves, just as they had done in Farloom. The residents of Deepnest were already spiders, similar to the weavers, making them the perfect population to integrate with, and this caused the physical traits of the weavers, as well as their culture, to become more ingrained in Deepnest spiders over time. Hey, thanks for watching my video. I had a lot of ideas regarding the Weavers of Deepnest, some of which I couldn't find a way to fit cleanly into this video. I'm hoping to release another video going over some of those theories in the coming months, so be sure to subscribe if you're interested in hearing more. See you next time!